All right. Let's talk a little bit about this really basic concept called intelligence. Intelligence is a concept. It's not a thing. It's a concept. What that means is there are all these different, components that feed into this idea of intelligence, and there are lots of different ways to define it, lots of different ways to measure it, and that makes it a concept, not an actual thing. Like, for example, height is a thing. There's an objective way to measure height. Intelligence is a concept, so there's lots of different ways that we can approach it and define it and deal with it. So what I wanted to do is introduce you to some different ways of dealing with intelligence. So one way that we can deal with intelligence is to say that it's a composite of abilities. You put together a whole bunch of different abilities, and then it emerges out that you can display intelligence. So people who follow that would be somebody like Alfred Benay. Benay was early in the 20th century. I think it was like 1920s, maybe even early 1910. He was hired by the French government to develop a test to administer to incoming children in the local elementary school to determine whether the children were cognitively ready for elementary school yet. If they weren't, it wasn't because they were, permanently unable. It was because they hadn't been exposed to enough things yet, and they needed to spend another year at home, sort of remediating those things, and they'd be ready next year. Benay assumed that intelligence was the combination of the capacity for comprehension, to understand things, and then the capacity for reasoning, being able to think about problems, solve problems, and so on. So he developed a test to determine a child's readiness for school that were based on these basic capacities. Now, there were some items on the test that were very, I guess they were comprehension based, but they were questions about, it was a French test, so cheese and wine, things like that. But there were also some, fundamental aspects of math included in the test, some fundamental aspects of reading. They were not expecting children to be able to do math and be able to read, but they, it's what we in cognitive psychology call like numerosity. Could they understand concepts of counting and things? Could they understand concepts of reading? They didn't need to be able to read, but they knew that these are letters and that these letters strung together make up a word and these kinds of things. So Benay developed an early test that was really for sorting children for school. Spearman over here in the US developed a two-factor theory of intelligence that said, okay, there's something called G, and he's most famous for Spearman's G, and that's your general intellectual capability, right? He thought that G was the same factor that determined math ability and reading ability, which are substantially different activities and are measured separately in most intelligence tests, but he thought the same basic intellectual skill underlies math, reading, art, like anything that you could really come up with. He thought really was, you have this basic underlying factor that he called G. Now, he did say there were some specialized intellectual capabilities that he called S, but he said that they were idiosyncratic and different people had different amounts of different kinds of things. But he said basically the most important thing for the purposes of intelligence testing would be the G factor, this basic general intellectual capability. For us, when we're talking about 2 to 6 year olds, probably the most important thing that I can say to you with regard to child development is that there are no known intelligence tests that adequately predict later intelligence that can be administered between the ages of 2 and 6. So you may have a child that is very precocious for their age, who between the ages of 2 and 6 are displaying reading skills or math skills or reasoning skills that are well beyond their peers. But that if you were to test them as a small child, at a 2 to 6 year old, they may score well on some measure, but that by the time they're 16 years old, they're probably going to be scoring in the normal range compared to their peers. On average, that's what typically happens. Now, there are rare exceptions that will always score higher than their peers. Right? There are certain individuals who will be geniuses their whole lives. But for most precocious children, the precocity wears off by the time they're in high school. Like on average, it goes away. So I will just say right now, with great confidence, because not only do I have a PhD in cognitive psychology, I teach tests and measurements, which is all about the development of these kinds of tests and so on, that there is no good, reliable, valid measure of intelligence for 2 to 6 year olds. You can measure readiness for school, you can do other kinds of things, but to make a prediction about, how much intelligence this individual possesses, it's impossible at this age. And it really doesn't become good and stable until you're probably into adolescence. Intelligence tests can produce highly variable scores for individuals up until about the age of 16, at which point things start to stabilize and intelligence testing makes more sense. So I like to include this now because we all seem to look at our children, or in my case, grandchildren, and we're like, wow, they're so smart. They seem so much smarter than I thought a 3-year-old would be or a 4-year-old would be. But in actuality, they're probably functioning very within the average range. Like the average range of intelligence would be somewhere between a score of 85 and 115 on a typical IQ test that you would administer to an adult. They're probably in that range as a child. Some kids are a little bit more verbal, some are not. Some kids are a little bit better with numbers right now, some are not. Some might be able to color really well and others can't. These things are not good predictors of lifelong skill sets with regard to cognition.